Most people don't notice when a shift begins, not because nothing changes, but because the change happens internally first. Before behavior adjusts, before choices narrow, before withdrawal becomes visible, the mind starts recalibrating quietly. When exclusion, rejection, or repeated dismissal occurs over time, the brain does not respond emotionally first. It responds predictively. The nervous system begins to anticipate loss, not as fear, not as sadness, but as a calculation. This is how expectations form. The brain learns patterns faster than consciousness can label them. When connection repeatedly results in disappointment, the mind adapts by lowering expectation before contact even happens. This is not pessimism, it is protection. Over time, the system stops asking, "Will I be included?" and starts assuming the answer in advance. This assumption changes perception. Neutral cues begin to feel loaded. Silence feels intentional. Distance feels personal, even when it isn't. The brain is no longer reacting to the present moment. It is responding to stored outcomes. This is where identity begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. The individual becomes less expressive, not because they lack emotion, but because expression has been historically costly. Engagement is reduced, needs are minimized, presence becomes conditional. From the outside, this can look like detachment. From the inside, it feels like regulation. The nervous system is conserving resources. This is why withdrawal is often misunderstood. It is not indifference. It is a learned risk management strategy. The mind is attempting to prevent another internal loss by reducing exposure to uncertain connection. And once this pattern stabilizes, it reinforces itself. The less one reaches, the fewer responses occur. The fewer responses occur, the more the expectation feels confirmed. At this stage, the system is no longer asking whether exclusion will happen. It is organizing life around the assumption that it will. This is the point where adaptation becomes identity. The brain does not start with logic. It starts with pattern. Before a word is spoken, before a message is sent, before a room is entered, the nervous system scans for history. It asks a question silently, not in language, but in sensation. Will I be included? That question does not come from weakness. It comes from memory. When exclusion has happened before, the body learns to predict it. Not because it is accurate, but because it once kept you safe. Over time, anticipation replaces observation. You begin preparing for rejection before it occurs. You soften your presence. You hesitate. You over-explain. Not consciously, automatically. The brain is not doing this to sabotage you. It is doing this to reduce shock, to avoid the pain of being caught off guard. This is how expectation forms, not as belief, but as protection. Eventually, the mind starts treating uncertainty as a threat. Neutral cues feel loaded. Silence feels personal. Distance feels deliberate. And so the system fills in the gaps, not with truth, but with what it knows. This is not imagination. It is conditioning. The brain prefers a familiar outcome over an unpredictable one, even if that outcome hurts, because unpredictability feels worse than disappointment. This is how anticipation becomes self-reinforcing. You brace, you withdraw, others respond to that distance, and the expectation feels confirmed. Not because it was correct, but because it shaped the interaction. This is where people get stuck, not in trauma itself, but in the prediction of it. And once prediction takes over, the present moment is no longer neutral. It is filtered. Every interaction is scanned for signs of exclusion, and the body stays alert long after the danger has passed. At some point, anticipation stops being a reaction and starts becoming an identity. You are no longer responding to the moment. You are responding to a version of the past that feels unfinished. The mind begins to organize itself around avoiding exclusion, not consciously, structurally. Choice is narrow. You choose what feels safest, not what feels most accurate. You wait longer before speaking. You measure tone. You track shifts in others more than yourself. This is not intuition. This is vigilance. And vigilance is exhausting because it never turns off. Even in neutral environments, the body stays alert. Muscles hold tension. Breathing stays shallow. Thoughts stay one step ahead. The nervous system is preparing for something that is not happening now, but once did. Over time, this creates a distortion. You start believing that belonging must be earned through adjustment. That safety comes from being less visible, less direct, less disruptive. Not because you are wrong, but because being fully present once carried consequences. This is how people lose access to their natural signal. They don't disappear, they compress. And compression feels like control, until it doesn't. Because the more you shrink to avoid rejection, the less grounded you feel in yourself. And that disconnection is often mistaken for calm. But it isn't calm, it's restraint. True regulation does not come from bracing against outcomes. It comes from allowing the present moment to be what it is, without preloading it with history. And this is the critical distinction. Healing is not about convincing yourself that exclusion will never happen again. It's about retraining the nervous system to stay here even when uncertainty exists. Because uncertainty is not danger, and anticipation is not protection anymore. There is a moment in healing that often feels like emptiness, not peace, not sadness, space. The urgency fades, the scanning quiets, and for the first time, nothing is demanding your attention. This is where many people panic. Because the nervous system mistakes the absence of threat for the absence of purpose. When survival has been the organizing force, stillness can feel wrong, unproductive, unfamiliar. You may notice a sense of detachment, not dissociation, not numbness. Detachment. The difference matters. Detachment is the system loosening its grip. It is the body realizing it no longer needs to perform vigilance to stay intact. Emotion doesn't disappear here. It reorganizes. Grief may surface quietly, not in waves, but in single drops. Tears without story. Without narrative. Just release. This is not regression. This is integration. The nervous system discharging what it no longer needs to hold. You are not losing depth. You are regaining bandwidth. And as that happens, clarity returns. Not as certainty about others, but as steadiness within yourself. You begin to notice how much energy was spent anticipating reactions that never came. How much of your life was shaped around preventing rupture instead of expressing truth. Here is the shift. Belonging stops being something you monitor. It becomes something you allow. You no longer ask, will I be included? You ask, am I present? And presence does not require permission. It requires regulation. From this place, boundaries stop feeling defensive. They feel neutral. Choices stop being strategic. They become aligned. You don't push. You don't retreat. You remain. And remaining without bracing is the signal that the nervous system is no longer trapped in the past. What changes here is not the world, it's the absence of bracing. For a long time, your system learned to stay slightly ahead of impact, reading tone, tracking shifts, preparing explanations. That readiness felt like intelligence, like intuition, but it was protection. and protection always costs energy. When the body no longer expects harm, it doesn't surge with relief, it softens. The muscles release in small increments. The breath lengthens without effort. Attention stops scanning the edges of experience. This is why calm can feel unfamiliar. Your nervous system isn't shutting down, it's recalibrating. Old reflexes begin to dissolve, not dramatically, quietly. You may notice fewer thoughts about how you're being perceived, less urgency to clarify yourself, less need to justify stillness. This is not withdrawal, this is orientation. The system learning that safety does not require performance. And as that settles, your sense of self becomes less reactive and more dimensional. You are no longer defined by who responds or who doesn't. You exist without needing confirmation. That is the difference between surviving connection and inhabiting it. At this stage, nothing needs to be forced, no insight extracted, no lesson concluded. The body understands before language does, and understanding without words is often the most stable kind. Nothing needs to resolve after this. There is no final realization to reach, no version of yourself to arrive at. What remains is presence without effort. The body no longer waits for the next shift in atmosphere. The mind no longer rehearses explanations that may never be asked for. You're not disengaged. You're unburdened. What once required vigilance now requires only awareness. And awareness does not strain, it observes. You may notice that certain dynamics no longer pull at you. Certain silences no longer feel personal. Certain absences no longer ask to be filled. That is not loss, that is discernment. Connection becomes optional, not urgent. Distance becomes neutral, not threatening. And in that neutrality, choice returns. Not as control, but as clarity. You don't move away from the world. You meet it without bracing. You don't disappear. You consolidate. This is what regulation looks like when it has fully integrated. Quiet, stable, unremarkable to others. But internally, there is space. And in that space, nothing is missing.